One-man army versus witch gang? They're shaking right now. You defeated a coven. The truth doesn't knock politely. Sometimes it kicks the door off the hinges, shatters all the windows, and sets the entire house on fire just to force you out of a room you were never meant to stay in. Most people out there in the world do not actually hate your intelligence, your light, or your authentic spirit. What they are absolutely violently terrified of is what your undeniable intelligence forces them to feel about themselves, and what your radiant light forces them to see in the dark, unhealed, rotting corners of their own minds. Chosen ones, I am speaking directly and unapologetically to you today. You have been walking through a deeply confusing, isolating, and heavy season that felt less like a standard spiritual awakening and far more like a coordinated, psychological ambush. You have found yourself standing completely alone against a network of deeply insecure, highly toxic, and frantically performative individuals. You thought you were just dealing with a few difficult personalities, but the spiritual and psychological reality is that you were facing down a literal witch gang. A desperate coven of gossips, manipulators, and energetic vampires who banded together because not a single one of them possessed the spiritual spine to face you one-on-one. You felt the heavy, suffocating weight of their collective projection, the constant whispering behind your back, the subtle campaigns to assassinate your character, and the relentless attempts to dismantle your hard-earned peace. But here is the raw, uncomfortable truth that has them shaking and hyperventilating right now. You did not just survive their coordinated attempts to destroy you. You, standing entirely alone in your truth, defeated a coven. You operated as a one-man army and absolutely decimated their shared, toxic illusion. They melted down completely over your success, your resilience, and your unapologetic authenticity, and now they are desperately trying to hide the wreckage of their own collapsed egos. Let's break down exactly why these people are currently exposing themselves, turning on each other, and losing their minds trying to compete with a spiritual frequency they cannot even comprehend. But before we dive into the deep psychological mechanics of this spiritual victory, I need you to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Let's begin. Number 1. They relied on the illusion of numbers and mob mentality because they completely lacked any individual substance. You have to look closely at the undeniable contrast between your solitary, hard-earned internal alignment and their desperate, frantic need to constantly travel in packs. The individuals who tried to take you down do not possess their own internal architecture. They are hollowed-out shells, deeply impoverished in their own spirits and completely reliant on external validation and the shared consensus of a toxic group just to feel a fleeting sense of identity. They needed a gang, a coven, a tight circle of enablers just to feel brave enough to even look in your direction. Your authentic, unwavering alignment, however, is built on years of solitary refinement. You spent countless nights battling your own internal demons in the absolute dark, forging your unbreakable spirit in the quiet, unseen moments where no one was applauding your survival. You have been meticulously stacking heavy bricks on solid ground, building an impenetrable fortress of genuine character. Contrast that monumental internal structure with their pathetic, performative facade. They are aggressively stacking flimsy playing cards on a windy table, terrified out of their minds that one single gust of objective truth will knock over their entire fabricated identity. The deep psychology here is rooted in their absolute, paralyzing terror of standing alone with their own thoughts. They behave exactly like a frantic pack of starving coyotes circling a solitary lion. They nip at your heels, they bark from the shadows, but they scatter the exact second you turn around to look them dead in the eye. They rely on the script of the mob because they possess zero individual substance or independent thought. When you proved that you could withstand the entire weight of their collective hatred without flinching, without calling frantically for backup, and without breaking character, you did not just defeat them. You completely humiliated their entire operational strategy. It looks deeply goofy and incredibly tragic from the outside. Watching a group of grown adults whispering, plotting, and obsessing over one person who is just quietly minding their business and elevating to the next level. They genuinely thought their sheer numbers would overwhelm your nervous system, but all it did was amplify their collective cowardice when the one-man army simply refused to fall. They are shaking violently right now because you proved to them that 1,000 empty, echoing shells will never equal the gravitational weight of one divinely anchored, highly aligned soul. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. Number 2, you force people to aggressively confront the intelligence, the healing, and the pure potential they permanently abandoned. You have to deeply understand that when a toxic group targets a chosen one, it is rarely because of anything you actually did to them. It is almost entirely because of what your mere existence represents. Contrast your relentless, painful internal alignment with their deeply comfortable, externalized stagnation. You are someone who has chosen the incredibly difficult path of absolute truth. You dig deep into your own psyche, you pull up the roots of your trauma, and you actively choose to evolve, even when the growing pains are excruciating. They, on the other hand, have chosen the path of least resistance. They wear a borrowed, highly performative facade that requires absolutely zero internal growth. They rely entirely on external validation, constantly seeking the cheap, fleeting applause of a room full of other unhealed people. The deep psychology behind their frantic hatred of you is inextricably tied to their profound fear of their own wasted potential. When you walk into a room, your very aura acts as a massive, uncompromising, high-definition mirror. You force them to look directly at the exact person they could have been if they hadn't given up on themselves. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. They see the calm, but not the resilience. And it absolutely infuriates them. It shatters their fragile egos because they can no longer pretend that their mediocrity is a result of bad luck or circumstance. Your undeniable success proves to them that their stagnation is a deliberate, cowardly choice. It is exactly like you are standing in the blazing sun, growing into a massive, deeply rooted tree, while they are hiding in a dark, damp basement, furiously complaining that the soil is bad. They act like someone wearing jewelry they can't afford, aggressively trying to convince everyone that they are rich, while you are quietly sitting there owning the entire bank. From the outside, their behavior looks incredibly tragic and profoundly goofy. They spend hours upon hours meticulously analyzing your life, searching for a single flaw to justify their intense jealousy, all while completely ignoring the massive, festering wounds destroying their own lives. They are shaking right now because your relentless elevation forces them to mourn the lives they voluntarily threw away just to fit in with a crowd of losers. You did not even have to speak to them to absolutely destroy their comfortable delusion. You just had to exist authentically, and that was enough to send their entire coven into a permanent psychological spiral. Number 3, their collective energy was entirely parasitic, whereas your spirit is an infinite, self-sustaining generator. We must dive down into the absolute core of how energy is transferred, stolen, and protected in these toxic dynamics. Look at the stark, undeniable contrast between your divine, internal alignment and their desperate, externally validated performance. You are tapped directly into a higher frequency. The source of your strength, your creativity, and your profound peace comes from within, perfectly aligned with the divine creator. You generate your own light. You do not need to tear another human being down to feel powerful, just like a roaring fire does not need to extinguish a candle to feel hot. The individuals in this witch gang, however, are entirely cut off from that divine source. They are energetic parasites. Because they lack their own internal architecture, they must constantly scavenge for energy in the dark. Their fragile egos survive strictly on the emotional reactions they can forcefully extract from other people. The deep psychology here reveals a terrifying reliance on a script you absolutely refuse to follow. They tried to provoke you, they tried to insult you, and they tried to aggressively pull you down into their low vibrational mud, desperately hoping you would react. They needed your anger, your tears, or your frustration to feed their starving egos. But you gave them absolutely nothing. You set an ironclad boundary and completely starved them out. It is the exact equivalent of a massive swarm of leeches frantically trying to attach themselves to a solid, impenetrable wall of titanium. They are slipping off, drying out, and frantically turning on each other because the host they targeted completely refused to bleed for them. The sheer, utter physical desperation of their current state is tragic to behold. It looks goofy, watching them constantly try to bait you, constantly throwing tiny, insignificant pebbles at your massive fortress, hoping you will eventually break character and lower the drawbridge. But you just sit there, perfectly calm, entirely unbothered, while they exhaust themselves to the point of a complete psychological breakdown. They are shaking because they have finally realized that they have absolutely zero access to your energetic vault. You systematically and ruthlessly proved that without your active participation, their parasitic coven is nothing but a starving, rapidly decaying echo chamber. Number 4, they never expected you to survive long enough to see their true faces permanently unmasked. The entire operational strategy of a toxic mob relies heavily on the element of surprise and the overwhelming, suffocating weight of sudden betrayal. They meticulously planned your downfall in the dark, whispering in corners, aligning their stories, and organizing a coordinated ambush that they genuinely believed would permanently break your spirit. They expected you to completely crumble under the immense pressure. Contrast your incredibly dense, hard-earned internal resilience with their flimsy, borrowed, performative courage. You have survived things that would have permanently destroyed their fragile minds. You have walked through valleys so dark that they would not even dare to look at a picture of them. Because your internal architecture is built on absolute truth and divine alignment, you have the stamina of a one-man army. They, however, have the stamina of a fragile, heavily scripted stage play. The deep psychology behind their absolute terror right now is rooted in their loss of control over the narrative. Narcissists and highly insecure manipulators operate under the strict assumption that their victims will never live long enough, emotionally or spiritually, to call them out. They expected you to run away and hide in shame, but you stood your ground. You weathered the massive initial storm without flinching, and because you survived, you are now standing in the broad daylight, looking directly at them as their masks violently slip off their faces. It is exactly like someone confidently stacking cards on a windy table, aggressively boasting about their architectural genius, only for you to calmly watch the wind blow the entire thing into the mud. You are stacking bricks on solid ground, and you have all the time in the world to watch them fail. It is profoundly satisfying to observe how truly frantic they look right now. They are physically sweating, pacing back and forth, because the very person they tried to quietly assassinate is now the primary witness to their absolute fraudulence. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. And that calm is currently torturing them. They are trapped in a room with the one person who knows exactly how weak, how cowardly, and how deeply insecure they truly are. You did not even have to expose them to the world. Your sheer survival was the ultimate exposure, leaving them entirely naked and shivering in the blinding light of your unshakable truth. Number 5. You systematically and ruthlessly proved that their perceived power was entirely reliant on the cheap illusion of intimidation. We need to completely dismantle the concept of power, as it is thoroughly misunderstood by highly performative, toxic people. Contrast your authentic, quiet, and incredibly heavy internal alignment with their loud, chaotic, and completely borrowed external facade. True power, the kind of power that rests in the spirit of a chosen one, is absolutely silent. It does not need to constantly announce itself. It does not need a gang of flying monkeys to validate its existence. It is a dense, gravitational pull that naturally commands respect. The Witch Gang, on the other hand, possesses absolutely zero actual power. Their entire influence is an optical illusion, heavily reliant on a script of intimidation that you simply refused to read. The deep psychology of a bully or a toxic coven is based on a fundamentally fragile ego that is mathematically terrified of its own impotence. They gather in numbers to cast a large shadow, hoping you will be too afraid to realize that the shadow is being cast by a group of incredibly small, terrified mice. They aggressively rely on your fear to make themselves feel big. When you boldly refused to be intimidated, when you looked dead into the center of their coordinated chaos and simply blinked, their entire power structure instantaneously vaporized into thin air. It is like watching a group of people wearing scary Halloween masks, jumping out from behind a corner, only for you to calmly walk past them, completely unimpressed by their cheap plastic costumes. From the outside, it looks incredibly goofy and profoundly tragic. They are expending massive amounts of energy trying to look tough, puffing out their chests and speaking in aggressive, coded language, but you see straight through to their trembling knees. You force them to confront the undeniable reality that they are nothing more than actors in a very bad play. The moment you stopped believing in their power, they ceased to exist as a threat. They are shaking right now because they have absolutely no backup plan for a target who is not afraid of them. You effortlessly disarmed an entire coven just by refusing to flinch, proving forever that highly organized darkness is completely powerless against a single, unflinching beacon of light. Number 6. Your profound silence was infinitely louder and vastly more destructive than their coordinated campaigns of chaos. When you are dealing with a coven of highly insecure, heavily performative individuals, their entire survival strategy relies on creating an unbearable amount of noise. They desperately need the chaos. Contrast your heavy, immovable, and deeply anchored internal peace with their frantic, dysregulated, and externally validated frenzy. You have built a sanctuary inside your own mind, a place of absolute stillness where the voice of the divine speaks clearly. They have turned their minds into a chaotic, burning circus, completely reliant on the constant, exhausting friction of drama just to feel alive. The deep psychology here is rooted in their absolute paralyzing fear of the quiet. If a toxic person sits in total silence, they are violently forced to hear the terrifying, undeniable voice of their own conscience screaming about their massive failures. Therefore, they tried to drag you into their noise. They wanted you to yell back, to defend yourself, to write long emotional paragraphs, and to completely lose your composure. By remaining totally and unconditionally silent, you did not just ignore them. You actively dropped a psychological bomb on their fragile egos. It is exactly like they are aggressively hammering away at a massive, solid steel vault with a tiny plastic spoon. They are exhausting themselves, sweating profusely, screaming at the top of their lungs, and you are inside the vault, peacefully reading a book, completely unbothered by the pathetic tapping on the outside. Your silence completely broke the script they were relying on. They do not know how to process a target that does not bleed when cut. It looks goofy and tragic as they continuously try to escalate their behavior, looking around frantically for an audience to validate their unhinged performance. You are torturing them with your peace. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. And because they cannot understand your peace, it terrifies them. They are currently losing their minds because your absolute refusal to engage permanently confirmed that they are entirely irrelevant to your existence. You defeated their massive campaign of chaos simply by allowing your heavy, unbreakable silence to completely suffocate their noise. Number 7. They desperately needed a scapegoat to bond over, and you broke their trauma bond by simply walking away. The fundamental architecture of a witch gang is entirely built upon a deeply flawed, incredibly toxic foundation. They do not gather together because they share a profound, uplifting vision for the future. Contrast your authentic, self-generated internal alignment with their borrowed, parasitic need for a common enemy. You are entirely whole on your own. You do not need to constantly tear another human being down to feel a fleeting sense of camaraderie with your peers. Your connections are built on genuine love, mutual respect, and shared growth. Their connections are built exclusively on shared hatred. The deep psychology of their group dynamic is that they are entirely comprised of deeply broken, highly insecure individuals who are desperately trying to avoid looking at their own massive shortcomings. To do this, they require a scapegoat. They need a target to project all their failures, their bitterness, and their profound self-loathing onto. For a short season, they aggressively chose you, but you did the one thing a scapegoat is never supposed to do in their twisted script. You simply packed up your immense light and walked completely away. By entirely removing yourself from their toxic equation, you inadvertently triggered the absolute collapse of their entire coven. It is exactly like a group of people aggressively pulling on a thick rope in a massive game of tug-of-war, only for you to suddenly and calmly let go of your end. They all violently fell backward into the mud of their own making. It is incredibly tragic and completely goofy to watch them now. Without you, there to absorb their collective venom, That venom has absolutely nowhere else to go but directly inward. They are now actively turning on each other. The very same people who plotted your downfall are now whispering about each other in the dark, deeply paranoid and completely unable to trust the person standing next to them. You did not even have to seek revenge. You just had to remove your authentic presence. They are shaking right now because they realize their entire bond was a complete illusion, held together only by their mutual obsession with your light. And without you, they are nothing but a room full of bitter, untrustworthy strangers. Number 8. The Coven fundamentally underestimated the quiet, terrifying spiritual backing of a truly chosen one. This is where the physical, performative games of highly insecure people violently crash into the undeniable, heavy reality of universal law. Contrast their cheap, earthly, highly manipulated social tactics with the ancient, unyielding, divine alignment that completely anchors your life. The people in this toxic gang measure power strictly by physical metrics. They look at follower counts, social status, bank accounts, and the number of flying monkeys they can command in a single group chat. They foolishly looked at you, saw a solitary individual walking a quiet path, and entirely miscalculated your actual strength. They entirely missed the massive, terrifying, spiritual army that constantly walks right behind you. The deep psychology of their arrogance is rooted in a profound, blinding God complex. Narcissistic, performative people genuinely believe they are the supreme authors of reality. They believe they can aggressively manipulate the universe without ever facing the brutal consequences of karma. They thought they could continuously throw heavy dirt on a highly anointed child of the light and simply walk away with completely clean hands. But they were desperately, tragically wrong. It is exactly like someone confidently strutting up to a massive, sleeping dragon with a tiny, damp matchstick, aggressively boasting to their friends about how they are going to conquer the beast. They are completely oblivious to the fact that one single breath from the dragon will instantly reduce their entire existence to ash. As you calmly continued your journey, completely unfazed by their petty attacks, the spiritual forces backing you stepped in to handle the heavy lifting. The reason they are frantically scrambling and shaking right now is because they are experiencing the terrifying, unexplainable blowback of their own actions. Doors are suddenly slamming in their faces. Their plans are violently backfiring. The very traps they meticulously dug for you have become the exact pits they are currently trapped in. You exposed the absolute embarrassing weakness of their earthly gang by simply allowing the divine backing of your internal architecture to completely obliterate their cheap, performative magic. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. And the spiritual weight of those battles is now crushing them entirely. Number 9. You forced the total and catastrophic collapse of their shared, delusional narrative. To properly understand the psychological mechanics of the witch gang, you have to understand that their entire bond is fundamentally completely disconnected from reality. It is predicated on a shared illusion and a mutual, obsessive hatred. Contrast your deep, objective grip on the truth with their frantic, emotionally driven psychosis. They fed off a heavily curated collective script that strictly dictated you were the problem, you were the villain, you were the crazy one, or you were the one who was ultimately going to fail miserably. They desperately needed you to react, to stumble, to beg for their approval, and to play the exact submissive role they meticulously assigned to you in their pathetic little stage play. But you flat out refused to read from their script. You stepped completely out of the frame of their projected reality. Your internal alignment is so deeply anchored in absolute truth that you literally became immune to their reality distortion field. You simply existed, you thrived in silence, and you moved forward with relentless momentum. And in doing so, you essentially took a match and set their entire script on fire. The psychology of the toxic imitator within a group dynamic is deeply tied to the fragile ego's absolute necessity to control the narrative at all times. When they lose control over how you are perceived by others, and far more importantly, when they lose control over how you perceive yourself, their fragile egos fracture into a million unrecoverable pieces. They are exactly like under-rehearsed, untalented actors screaming on a stage where the main audience member has suddenly stood up, yawned, and walked out the door forever. They keep performing, they keep shouting their bitter lines louder and louder to each other, but there is absolutely no one left to validate their tragic performance. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. By utterly refusing to engage in their delusional, fabricated reality, you violently force them to sit in the deafening, uncomfortable silence of their own mediocrity. They look completely frantic, unhinged, and desperately lost as they try to keep the false narrative alive. But the illusion has already collapsed under the sheer weight of your authenticity. Number 10. The brutal, uncompromising exposure of their highly performative empathy and totally fake, engineered virtue. In the modern era, one of the absolute most insidious and deeply deceptive tactics of a witch gang is the aggressive weaponization of fake morality. Contrast your raw, unpolished, but deeply genuine goodness with their highly curated, perfectly filtered, entirely hollow performance of virtue. You actually do the hard work of being a good person behind closed doors. You show massive grace, you quietly help others, and you fiercely protect your internal alignment without ever needing an audience to applaud your morality. They, however, use words like empathy and virtue as heavy, suffocating masks to completely hide their festering malice. The deep psychology of the covert narcissist or the highly performative hater is entirely built on an absolute, paralyzing fear of being truly seen. They know, deep down in their core, that they are deeply toxic, incredibly jealous, and fundamentally broken. So, they overcompensate by aggressively portraying themselves as the ultimate victims or the supreme moral authorities. They banded together to attack you under the fake, engineered guise of holding you accountable or protecting the group. But your undeniable, steady, blazing light completely burned right through their cheap masks. It is exactly like someone wearing a beautiful, highly expensive-looking white coat that is actively bleeding thick, dark mud from the inside out. They are aggressively smiling, speaking in soft, therapeutic buzzwords, pretending to be healed, but absolutely everyone with an ounce of spiritual discernment can clearly smell the rotting scent of their true intentions. When you completely refused to fight them in the mud, you inadvertently forced them to keep performing their fake virtue until they became absolutely exhausted. And when the exhaustion set in, the masks violently slipped. Now the entire world is slowly beginning to clearly see the absolute fangs hiding behind their fake, strained smiles. They are shaking right now because they know that you know exactly who they are, and your total uncompromising silence is the loudest, most devastating exposure of their entirely engineered, highly performative existence. Number 11. The sheer, utter, physical desperation of frantically trying to maintain a completely copied, heavily manufactured aura. There is an incredibly profound, deeply tragic phenomenon that occurs when a group of deeply empty individuals targets a chosen one. They simultaneously hate you and desperately want to be exactly like you. Contrast your highly original, organically grown internal alignment with their cheap, pixelated, entirely heavily manufactured attempts at mimicry. You carry your light effortlessly because it is intrinsically woven into your very DNA. You spent years in the dark, painstakingly building the spiritual muscles required to carry the massive weight of your divine calling. The people in this coven completely skipped the heavy lifting. They looked at your massive aura, your quiet confidence, and your undeniable magnetism, and they foolishly decided they could simply copy and paste it onto their own lives. The deep psychology behind this frantic mimicry is a profound, echoing void of personal identity. They are empty vessels, completely devoid of any original thought or genuine substance. So, they aggressively study you. They study how you speak, how you carry your boundaries, and how you naturally command respect. Then they try to wear your personality like a cheap Halloween costume. But it is incredibly, physically exhausting to constantly pretend to be someone you are not. It is exactly like someone who has absolutely never lifted a single weight in their life, suddenly trying to walk around, carrying a massive 500-pound boulder on their back, aggressively smiling and pretending it is totally effortless. Their knees are buckling, their spine is snapping, and they are profusely sweating under the crushing weight of their own fake performance. From the outside, it looks absolutely goofy and incredibly tragic. You can clearly see the frantic, heavy desperation in their eyes as they constantly try to keep up the facade. They see the confidence but not the internal battles. They see the calm but not the resilience. And because they do not have the internal architecture to support the heavy energy they are trying to steal, they are constantly violently collapsing in on themselves. They are shaking because they deeply realize that no matter how hard they try to copy your external moves, they will absolutely never ever possess your internal divine weight. Number 12. You unequivocally, permanently proved that highly organized and concentrated darkness absolutely cannot effectively conquer pure, unadulterated, blinding light. We have to look at the absolute fundamental physics of spiritual warfare. The individuals who formed this highly toxic gang genuinely believed that if they just gathered enough negative energy in one single place, they could successfully extinguish your flame. Contrast your singular, massive, intensely focused beam of pure light with their scattered, chaotic, entirely low-vibrational pool of darkness. Your internal alignment is a highly organized, divinely structured force of nature. It operates on the absolute highest frequencies of truth, resilience, and genuine love. Their coven operates entirely on the lowest, most unstable frequencies of envy, paranoia, and deep-seated fear. The deep psychology of their colossal failure is rooted in their absolute misunderstanding of how true power actually functions. They foolishly thought that darkness was a substance that could forcefully overpower light, completely failing to realize that darkness is simply the total absence of light. It has absolutely no mass, no substance, and no actual power. It is exactly like a massive, highly organized group of people aggressively marching into a pitch-black room, forcefully throwing buckets of dark paint at a blazing, massive sun, genuinely expecting the sun to go out. The paint instantly vaporizes before it even gets close, and the sun simply continues to burn, completely unbothered by the pathetic, frantic display. By simply refusing to ever dim your own light to make them feel more comfortable, you completely and entirely annihilated their entire offensive strategy. You did not have to fight their darkness. You just had to continue shining absolutely, blindingly bright. They are physically shaking and experiencing a complete psychological meltdown because they have finally, agonizingly realized that all their highly organized plotting, all their late-night gossiping, and all their desperate, toxic spells were completely and utterly useless against a spirit that is entirely anchored in the divine. You permanently proved that 1,000 shadows will absolutely never possess the strength to conquer a single, unwavering ray of authentic truth. Number 13, the paranoid, rapid unraveling of their fragile loyalty as they desperately begin to cannibalize their own team. When a massive, coordinated attack completely fails against an unbreakable target, the venom they summoned has to be injected somewhere. Contrast your complete, unwavering peace of mind with their frantic, hyper-vigilant paranoia. You are resting comfortably in the knowledge that you have done absolutely nothing wrong. Your conscience is clean, and your internal architecture is secure. They, however, are currently living in a psychological war zone of their own making. The deep psychology of a toxic group dynamic dictates that there is absolutely no honor among thieves, because they have spent months or years proving to each other exactly how easily they can lie, manipulate, and betray an innocent person. They now inherently know that they are surrounded by liars, manipulators, and betrayers. The moment you completely withdrew your energy and proved you could not be broken, their outward aggression immediately turned inward. It is exactly like watching a group of venomous snakes that were forcefully shoved into a tightly sealed glass box. Since they can no longer reach the person outside the box, they are aggressively biting each other to death. From your elevated vantage point, it is profoundly goofy to witness. The ringleaders are blaming the followers for not pushing hard enough. The followers are deeply resenting the ringleaders for dragging them into a battle they could not win. They are constantly side-eyeing each other, secretly taking screenshots of their own group chats, and preparing to throw their closest allies directly under the bus the second things go completely wrong. They see the calm, but not the resilience. They see the confidence, but not the internal battles. And because they lack your internal fortitude, their external alliances are rapidly shattering. You defeated their coven without throwing a single punch, simply by letting the natural, highly destructive mechanics of their own unchecked toxicity completely devour them from the inside out. Number 14, the absolute, final, completely soul-crushing realization that they absolutely never, ever stood a single chance against you from the very beginning. This is the absolute ultimate, heavy, undeniable truth that is currently keeping them wide awake in the dead of the night, staring blankly at the ceiling in a cold, trembling sweat. When they first formed their little witch gang, their toxic coven of deeply insecure haters, they genuinely, arrogantly believed they had the absolute upper hand. Contrast their highly finite, entirely earthly arrogance with your infinite, deeply anchored, divine sovereignty. They thought this was a fair fight. They thought you were just a normal, unprotected person who would eventually break under the heavy, coordinated pressure of their entirely fabricated reality. The deep psychology of their absolute, crushing defeat is tied directly to the permanent shattering of their God complex. They have finally painfully reached the absolute end of their heavily rehearsed script. They have aggressively fired every single bullet in their toxic arsenal. They have told every lie, orchestrated every smear campaign, and cast every desperate, low-vibrational spell they could possibly muster. And yet, the smoke has completely cleared. The dust has entirely settled, and you are still standing there. You are not just standing. You are massively thriving, completely untouched, entirely unbothered, and radiating an even brighter, more intense light than before. It is exactly like a group of highly arrogant, incredibly weak children, aggressively trying to physically push over a massive, deeply rooted, ancient mountain, entirely exhausting themselves until their bones literally break. While the massive mountain doesn't even register their tiny, pathetic existence, the profound, tragic realization currently absolutely crushing their fragile egos is that the entire game was completely rigged in your favor by the divine before they even made their very first move. They were entirely, hopelessly outmatched from day one. They are shaking right now because they completely realize that they absolutely never had any real power. They absolutely never posed a genuine threat. And their entire, exhaustive, highly coordinated attack was absolutely nothing more than a deeply embarrassing, entirely performative tantrum against a one-man army who is infinitely, permanently, and undeniably backed by the creator of the universe. When you zoom out and deeply look at the absolute totality of this incredibly chaotic, highly performative landscape, one massive, undeniable truth becomes completely and entirely impossible to ever ignore again. The frantic witch gang, the insecure coven, the toxic imitators. They were absolutely never truly targeting your physical actions, your simple words, or your completely normal daily choices. They were meticulously, aggressively, and desperately targeting your pure, unwavering, blazing energy and your deep, entirely unbreakable, massive, spiritual alignment. They desperately wanted to aggressively steal the very architecture of your brilliant soul, precisely because their own weak, rotting internal structures were violently crumbling under the heavy, crushing weight of their own intense, unhealed self-hatred. You stood completely alone as a highly powerful, immovable, one-man army, and you effortlessly survived the exact kind of highly coordinated, massive spiritual warfare that was specifically, meticulously designed to leave you completely, permanently hollow. But instead of breaking you, it completely polished you. It massively fortified you. It loudly and undeniably proved to the entire, massive universe exactly who you truly are at your absolute core. Remember this absolute, unshakable truth, chosen ones. You absolutely do not ever, for the rest of your entire life, need to prove a single thing to these totally hollowed out, pathetic shells. You absolutely do not ever need to perform for their highly toxic gaze. You absolutely do not need to justify your massive, ironclad boundaries. And you certainly, unequivocally, do not ever need to seek any form of petty, earthly revenge. Their current, miserable existence, completely trapped in the permanent, inescapable, incredibly dark prison of their own rotting stagnation, and their profound, intense inadequacy, is a heavy punishment, far, far worse than absolutely anything you could ever possibly inflict upon them. Your absolute only job right now is to confidently keep stacking those heavy bricks on completely solid ground, to relentlessly keep expanding your massive spirit, and to fiercely remain entirely, unapologetically authentic in a dark world, totally full of incredibly cheap, borrowed, frantic copies. Let them desperately scramble in the absolute dirt, while you joyfully continue to perfectly build your massive, undeniable empire directly in the blazing sun. Subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, drop a comment with what point hit you hardest, and share this video with someone who needs the reminder. Stay chosen, stay blessed.